The Legend of Zelda is one of the most iconic series in all of gaming and also happens to be my personal favorite. I've set out to rank every main series game and compile the ultimate Zelda series ranking. In this video, we are looking at one of the most popular Zelda games ever, The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. We will be scoring the game across these 10 categories. Each category will be scored from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. Each category score is being chosen in relation to the other games in the series. At the end, everything will be averaged out to get our final result. A quick note, the score will be entirely based off of the Wii U HD version. Though I don't think I would have scored the GameCube version much differently, if at all. I have never played the game on the Wii, so that version will not play any role in this review. And oh yeah, spoilers ahead. Also, make sure to stick around to the end of the video where I will reveal the next Zelda review. The story starts with Link working on a ranch in Ordon Village. One day, some monsters take away the village's children. Link goes after them and encounters a wall of twilight. A twilight monster pulls him beyond the wall and into the twilight-shrouded forest, where he is transformed into a wolf and imprisoned. Link is soon freed by an imp-like character named Midna, who offers to help him if he obeys her. She guides him to Princess Zelda, who explains that Zant, the usurper king of Twilight, invaded Hyrule Castle and forced her to surrender. The kingdom became enveloped in twilight, turning all of its inhabitants, besides Link and Zelda, into invisible spirits. To save Hyrule, Link, aided by Midna, must first revive the light spirits by entering the twilight-covered regions and recovering the light spirits from the twilight beings that had stolen it. Once revitalized, each spirit returns Link to his Hylian form and informs Link and Midna of the hidden location of a fused shadow, one of the fragments of a powerful relic that will have to be used to match Zant's power to defeat him. During this time, the ghost of a departed swordsman, the hero Shade, also appears to provide swordsmanship training he had failed to pass on before his untimely death, as well as information regarding Link's destiny in Hyrule. During his journey, Link also finds Ordon Village's children and assists the monkeys of Faron, the Gorons of Eldin, and the Zoras of Lanayru. After restoring the light spirits and obtaining the fused shadows, Link and Midna are ambushed by Zant, who takes away the fragments. Midna calls him out for abusing his tribe's magic, but Zant reveals that his power comes from another source, and he uses it to trap Link in his wolf state. Failing to persuade Midna into joining forces with him, Zant attempts to dispose of her by exposing her to the light of Lanayru's light spirit. Bringing a dying Midna to Zelda, Link learns from her that he needs to find the Master Sword to remove Zant's curse, and she proceeds to sacrifice herself to heal Midna, vanishing mysteriously. Moved by Zelda's act of selfishness, Midna starts to care more about Link and the fate of his world. After gaining the Master Sword, Link is cleansed of the curse that kept him in wolf form. Deep within the Gerudo Desert, Link and Midna search for the Mirror of Twilight, the only known gateway between Hyrule and the Twilight Realm, but discover that it's broken. The sages there explain that Zant tried to destroy it, but only managed to shatter it into fragments. Only the true ruler of the Twilight can completely destroy the mirror. They also relay that they once used it to banish Ganondorf, the Gerudo leader who attempted to steal the Triforce, to the Twilight Realm after failing to execute him. Link and Midna set out to retrieve the missing shards of the mirror. Once it has been fully restored, the sages reveal to Link that Midna is actually the true ruler of the Twilight, usurped and cursed into her current form by Zant. Confronting Zant, Link and Midna learn that he forged a pact with Ganondorf, who asks for his assistance in subjugating Hyrule. After Link defeats Zant, Midna recovers the fused shadows and destroys Zant after learning that only Ganondorf's defeat can release her from her curse. Returning to Hyrule, Link and Midna fight Ganondorf in Hyrule Castle with a lifeless Zelda suspended above him. Ganondorf fights Link by possessing Zelda and then transforming into a gigantic boar-like beast. but Link defeats him, and the power Midna received from Zelda is able to resuscitate her. Ganondorf revives, and Midna teleports Link and Zelda outside the castle so she can hold him off with the fused shadows. However, as Hyrule Castle collapses, Ganondorf emerges from it victorious, crushing the fused shadow piece that Midna wore on her head and pursues Link on horseback. Assisted by Zelda and the Light Spirits, Link eventually knocks Ganondorf off his horse and duels him on foot before finishing him off with the Master Sword. With Ganondorf defeated, the Light Spirits revive Midna and restore her to her true form. After bidding farewell to Link and Zelda, Midna returns home and destroys the Mirror of Twilight, ultimately severing the link between Hyrule and the Twilight Realm. As Hyrule Castle is rebuilt, Link leaves Ordon Village, heading to parts unknown. I'm giving the story a 4 out of 5. Midna is the central focus and one of the best developed characters in the entire Zelda series. Her story alone carries this category for me. The rest of the story is standard at best and disappointing at worst. I don't think I've ever been more let down by a Zelda character than with Zant. I felt like Zant had the makings to be a really cool new villain, and they kind of made him into a joke by the end when he loses his mind. I understand that this is a way to set up Ganondorf as the true villain, but I really just wanted Zant to be something more. Although there's some really awesome moments with Ganondorf in this story, I feel like he didn't need to be here. This more than any other game does it really feel like he's forced in. Zelda also takes a back seat in the game, and that's totally fine. I just wish they made it more clear what's going on when she sacrifices herself to save Midna, and then she's just randomly back later. It's all very vague, so you don't end up understanding what's at stake. And for anyone defending this part of the story with Zelda, then I ask you, why to this day do people still ask how Zelda came back at the end of Twilight Princess? Twilight Princess throws a lot of characters at you, and for me, only some of them really stick. I really enjoy Link's rivalry with King Bulblin. It was really refreshing to see a Zelda enemy actually betray Ganondorf in the end. One thing that has never landed for me is the kids and Ilia from Ordon Village. For all the time they spend at the beginning of the game on them, I just never really cared. The Wind Waker had me more invested in saving Link's sister in the first 15 minutes than any of the characters in Twilight Princess not named Midna. The world of Twilight Princess would best be described as a mixed bag. For the positives, I love how alive Castletown feels. Even though there's not a ton to do there, they make it feel like it's always bustling with people and so much is going on around you. Ordon Village feels nice and quaint, Lake Hylia is serene and peaceful. Some areas you can tell they tried to make them feel large, but it just didn't work for me. A common complaint is that Hyrule Field is empty, and I can see why people say that. In previous playthroughs, I would just ride through these areas with Epona or run through with Wolf Link and not even think twice about it. But when you stop and actually take a look around, oh boy, it's pretty empty, guys. I know there's some things to do here, but it's bland. Like, really bland. You can really tell the developers wanted to make everything feel epic and grand, but they didn't either have the time or resources to actually fill that space with enough interesting things or even scenery for that matter. On the opposite end, the Gerudo Desert is something you can tell they wanted to seem really large, but it's actually pretty tiny. They added a bunch of rifts in the ground so that you couldn't just take a straight path to Arbiter's grounds and realize how small the area actually is. 3 out of 5 for the world. Twilight Princess couldn't fill the big shoes it wanted to, but it still does enough to give you quite a few lively and memorable locations. Hyrule Field is a bit of an embarrassment, but at least they get the important places right, like Zora's Domain, Snow Peak, and Hyrule Castle. The art style of Twilight Princess feels very dark and moody. The Twilight Realm and creatures are very distinct and unlike anything we've seen in a Zelda game before. In general, I think the art style is solid. This is probably the closest Nintendo has ever gotten to trying to portray a realistic art style for a Zelda game, but they also throw in a lot of cartoony stuff too, which can make things clash at times. I think where things go wrong are a lot of character designs. The main cast, Link, Midna, Zelda, Zant, and Ganondorf all look great. When you get to some of the other characters like Colin, Russell, some of the Gorons, they look distractingly awkward, almost like the art director spilled his coffee on the keyboard when he had the face slider tool open. Outside of Hyrule Field, the environments all mostly hold up, but there's definitely still areas that can look boring and plain. The art style gets a 4 out of 5. Twilight Princess has a distinct look and feel that no other Zelda game has. It doesn't always work in its favor, but when it does, it works well. The designs of the main cast of characters are some of, if not the best in the entire series. The gameplay and combat as Link takes the classic 3D style to its absolute peak. I can honestly see why they tried something new with the combat in Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild, because there wasn't much else they could do to improve upon this style. Combat feels very smooth, and the newly added sword techniques make slicing up enemies an absolute blast. For some reason, targeting can get a little wonky sometimes, making it difficult to land a final blow on an enemy, but it wasn't enough to say the combat was in any way unresponsive. I wish I could end the category here and give it a 5 out of 5, but we have the wolf. Now, I'm not going to totally hate on the wolf here. The combat with Wolf Link is okay. It's not exactly fun, but I'll say it's passable. The required wolf sections, though, do not make for great gameplay. Getting the light spirits by killing a bunch of bugs is always a section I can't wait to be done with. Let's talk about another thing that's bothered me about Wolf Link gameplay. This. What is this? This isn't gameplay. I'm pushing a button. I'm just pushing a button. Yeah, maybe 5% of these situations I have to time the button press, but otherwise this just feels out of place to me. There needed to be something more to the Midna and Wolf Link gameplay here. If Donkey Kong Country can make pushing a single button during the barrel sections fun, Nintendo could have done the same thing with Twilight Princess. If you're not going to do that, let's give our boy a doggy ramp or something, because I don't really see the point of this button press minigame. Besides the wolf, we have other required sections that I just don't find fun. Protecting the wagon and the bridge duels with King Boblin look awesome on paper, but just don't exactly work for me. Controlling Epona in these parts just feels clunky. I'm not saying Epona is any better in a game like Ocarina of Time, but at least using her is completely optional in that game. Not all of the non-standard gameplay sections are bad though. The game provides a lot of fun moments too, like snowboarding down to Snow Peak Ruins, using a golden chicken to get back to the Lost Woods, and riding a canoe down the river. Gameplay gets a 4 out of 5. Thankfully, the majority of the gameplay is spent as Link with the best gameplay the classic 3D era, i.e. pre-Breath of the Wild, has to offer. Wolf Link not exactly being the most riveting gameplay, plus some not so great required sections, had to bring this category down at least 1 point. Twilight Princess has some of the most creative and cool items in the series. Of course, we have your staples like the bow and arrow and bombs, but they also found a way to add more to those classic items with things like the water bombs, which can be used underwater, and the Hawkeye, which can help improve your aim for the bow and arrow. Other returning items like the iron boots are used in a new way by being able to cling to magnetized areas on walls and ceilings, and the Gale Boomerang has added the effect of having a wind tornado follow in its path. The standout new items are for sure the spinner and the ball and chain. The spinner is the closest we will ever get to a Zelda and Tony Hawk mashup, but that item helps make Arbiter's Grounds one of the most fun and memorable dungeons in the game. There may not be an item more satisfying than the ball and chain. Smashing through ice walls and absolutely decimating these spear guys is just too much fun. Finally, the double claw shots were a clever way of expanding upon the hook shot, allowing Link to directly hook from one place to another, creating some fun and interesting gameplay sections. Unfortunately, the item loses a bit of the character that it had in previous Zelda games, with it now being limited to very specific targets, when in previous games there was a lot more variety of what you could hook onto. The items get a 4 out of 5. This collection of items is one of the best in the series. However, a common and valid complaint is that most of the items don't see much utilization after their respective dungeons. If you dabble into some of the side content, you will end up using things like, say, the spinner a bit more, but I definitely agree that it felt like there was a lot left to explore for these items. If there's one thing Twilight Princess does right, it's dungeons. The first dungeon is the Forest Temple. This is probably my least favorite dungeon in the game, and it's really not that bad. You search through the dungeon saving monkeys, which will eventually lead you to the boss. My only major complaint is that it goes on a bit too long for a first dungeon. Otherwise, it's fine. Next is the Goron Mines. There's a lot of interesting moments here, walking on the walls, upside down on the ceiling, using your magnetized iron boots. It can be a little slow at times due to how slow you're actually walking with the boots, but I always find this dungeon to be enjoyable. You collect pieces of the boss key from each of the Gorons and you eventually make your way to that final boss. The Lakebed Temple is in my opinion the most difficult dungeon in the game, and it shows up pretty early, being only the third dungeon. Knowing where to go and when is not as straightforward as the other dungeons in the game. I wouldn't say it's overly difficult, but it definitely makes you think. Using switches to enable water to flow in different directions and ultimately raise the water in the central area was a fresh take on a water-style dungeon. Arbiter's Grounds is one of the better themed dungeons in the game. The now abandoned prison of Hyrule has a creepy atmosphere. It starts out very familiar to a dungeon you may have heard of before. Light 4 fires by defeating some Poe-spirits in the first dungeon after obtaining the Master Sword. But this dungeon certainly stands on its own. It houses one of the most fun and unique Zelda items in the spinner, even if it isn't used quite as much as I would like it to be. Snow Peak Ruins could very well be a perfect Zelda dungeon in my opinion, taking place in what looks like an abandoned stronghold of the royal family of Hyrule. Snow Peak Ruins tells a touching story about a Yeti couple as you're playing through it. This dungeon, more than almost any other, meshes story and dungeon very well. It really feels like these Yetis live there as you collect soup ingredients and they slowly open up the doors for you to explore new areas. This on top of the fact that I generally enjoy ice-themed dungeons with things like ice block puzzles, I really always find this one to be a blast to play through. The Temple of Time is a really cool nod to Ocarina of Time with its own characteristics to make it unique. This, in my opinion, is a linear dungeon done right. You navigate all the way to the end, go through various puzzles, only to control a giant statue and smash your way back through to the very start. It's a very satisfying feeling to break through a bunch of walls that previously hindered your path in the dungeon. City in the Sky is one I don't hear many praise, but I enjoy it. It does have its moments where it feels a bit slow and you're just waiting to lock on to your next claw shot target, but overall, it's so much fun to use those double claw shots and hook all around into these areas that feel really dangerous to navigate. The Palace of Twilight is probably the shortest dungeon in the game, but I appreciate that it goes for a different feel than the others. Obviously, the Twilight theming is unique in its own way, but this dungeon also has plenty of intense moments when you're trying to get the light orbs back and are running away from these creepy hands that are stalking you. Finally, Hyrule Castle is nothing short of epic. This is the best version of the Hyrule Castle dungeon we have seen to date, in my opinion. I love the quiet atmosphere starting out in the rainy courtyard, then working your way in and through the castle itself. The music sets the mood very well, starting with a somber and subtle version of the Hyrule Castle theme, with Ganon's theme slowly creeping in more and more as you scale higher within the castle. Dungeons, unsurprisingly, get a 5 out of 5. Twilight Princess has one of, if not the best dungeon lineup in the entire series. Each dungeon is at best amazing and at worst still pretty good. I really like how each dungeon feels like it has a purpose in the game's world, and most also have a story going on as you play through it, increasing the level of immersion. Whether you're rescuing monkeys, helping a Yeti couple, or saving a floating city from a menacing dragon, the extra level of thought and care put into these dungeons makes them really stand out. The standard enemies in Twilight Princess are much darker and more sinister looking than any other game in the series. Don't let those scary looks fool you though, as most enemies like Bulblins and Bokoblins are complete pushovers. The Twilight sections have their own unique enemies, which is pretty cool. The areas with Shadow Beasts start to get pretty repetitive though. Once you know how to stop them from resurrecting each other, it's just the same thing over and over. I'm surprised that they didn't try to ramp up the difficulty of this section even a little bit as you got later into the game. The best standard enemy in the game by far are the Dark Nuts. It's the only enemy that feels like you actually need your sword techniques to defeat them. Starting out with heavy armor and a large sword and wearing them down to using a faster weapon and losing their armor makes for an actual challenge. As far as mini-bosses go, they are all pretty memorable. Ook is a very unique and amusing fight. Dangoro is fun, albeit very easy. Deku Toad is probably one of the most disgusting bosses in Zelda history. Death Sword has one of the coolest designs. I just wish there was a little more to it. Dark Hammer can be pretty tough if you're not quick, and I actually almost died against it, but lucky for me, it doesn't take too many hits to go down. Eralfos is pretty fun in your first encounter with it as a mini-boss, and of course, the previously mentioned King Bulblin is indeed quite memorable, even if I don't like every encounter with him. On to the main bosses now. Diababa is the boss of the Forest Temple and probably the least exciting in the game. It can be a little tricky to target your boomerang right and get the bombs to hit the boss, but it is a cool idea on paper for the Gale Boomerang. I do also like how Ook helps you after you saved him in the dungeon earlier. Virus looks awesome, but unfortunately, the actual boss battle isn't nearly as exciting as it looks. I mean, the boss is literally a pushover. Knock him down, slash him, rinse and repeat. This fight desperately needed another phase. Morpheal starts out on the ocean floor and is basically a retread of the Morpha fight from Ocarina of Time. In Phase 2, much like Virus, we have a cool looking fight that is just way too easy. You hook onto Morpheal and stab away. I like that it gives us some Shadow of the Colossus vibes, but I don't even know if it's possible to even take a single hit of damage in the second phase, which turns what could have been something more interesting into a bit of a joke. I don't think I have to explain too much about why Star-Lord is one of the best boss fights ever made. This fight is just pure fun. The spinner is such a fun item, and it's particularly fun in this fight. The first phase has you bouncing around like a pinball trying to break his spine, and then in the second phase, it's just a blast as you jump from side to side, avoiding hazards and trying to knock into Star-Lord. Blizzetta is nothing particularly special, but with the ball and chain being so fun and satisfying to use, I like the fight. And how can you not be happy every time you get to save Yetta? Armagoma is probably the second weakest boss fight in the game. I feel like there could have been more interesting ways to incorporate the Dominion Rod into a boss fight. This one definitely needed another phase as well. The fight with Argorok is a pretty epic one. It's not often in Zelda that you get to fight a giant dragon. I think this one makes great use of the double claw shots. The fight against Zant is one of my personal favorites. Going through a variety of boss and mini-boss fights and then ending off in front of Hyrule Castle really plays well into the chaotic nature they were trying to portray with him losing his mind at the end of the game. It works well and it's a blast to play through. Last, but certainly not least, is the 4-phase battle with Ganondorf. Ganon's Puppet Zelda is an awesome twist on the classic Zelda tennis fight that we've come to know in many games. Dark Beast Ganon is usually the phase I have the most trouble with. It can be a little difficult and tricky to time that button press right and throw Beast Ganon with Wolfling. Then we have my least favorite section where you are on horseback and you're trying to get Zelda to hit Ganon with those light arrows and then slash him with the Master Sword. Sometimes the timing just never works out right, and it can be very annoying when you can't hit Ganon even though you're swinging your sword like a maniac. We conclude with an epic standoff with Ganondorf in a straight sword fight to ultimately become the victor. While not every phase is perfect, it has to go down as one of the most epic conclusions to a Zelda game. Bosses and enemies get a 4 out of 5. Twilight Princess has some pretty unique enemies, great mini-bosses, and boss battles that feel truly epic. The problem is that the game often takes a style over substance approach. Many bosses look super menacing, but don't live up to the hype. That being said, many of the fights, even the easier ones, can still be a ton of fun. Twilight Princess brings quite a bit of side content to the table. The choice to have 5 heart pieces make a full heart in the game instead of 4 means there's just as many to collect, if not more, than most other 3D Zelda games, despite the larger dungeon count. Twilight Princess has a number of minigames, many which embrace the silly side of Zelda just to make things fun. Games range from floating into a lake with a cuckoo, hookshotting to collect stars, riding a bird to collect fruit, fishing in a canoe, to literally a game built around talking to cats. And no, you can't steal them, trust me, I tried. There's a few puzzles scattered in the overworld that will usually net you a heart piece, and there's also the odd cave hidden about, which were pretty fun to explore considering I've never seen them before. Much like Wind Waker, there's also a giant enemy gauntlet cave, this time called the Cave of Ordeals. Another exclusive wolf-only cave was added in the HD version, but I didn't end up getting to it. We also have a couple longer exploring side quests with collecting bugs for Agatha and listening to her creepy little poems about them. And the Poe collection quest, very reminiscent of Ocarina of Time, but with much more Poes to collect and a little bit less annoying in my opinion. Side content gets a 4 out of 5. Twilight Princess is definitely one of the better games when it comes to side content. The minigames are up there as some of the best in the series. Most of the rewards are pretty standard, though they did throw some exciting but not so useful rewards like the magic armor. Overall, very good though. Alright, I gotta start this one off with an apology. For anyone who watched my Zelda soundtrack tier list, here you go. There, I hope you feel better now. The music in Twilight Princess was better than I remembered it. There's a great variety of memorable tracks. Some of my favorites include Lake Hylia, Faron Woods, and the post-boss battle music. And of course, everyone's favorite, Midna's Lament. That music creates one of the most memorable moments in any Zelda game. I only wish they just removed all the enemies off of Hyrule Field during this section to really let the emotion set in, because when the music changes, it just kind of kills the mood. Music gets a 4 out of 5. While it's not my favorite Zelda soundtrack, it does stand on its own without too much reliance on a lot of familiar Zelda tracks. The leitmotif of Midna's theme is smartly used throughout the soundtrack to give it a consistent thematic feel. Aside from the dungeon content, nearly the entire first half of Twilight Princess is just way too slow and boring. It's really a shame because the game decides to find the fun in the second half. I see many trying to defend the first half of this game, saying it helps establish Link's plain boring life before the Twilight invasion, but I'm sorry, it's just not interesting or compelling story or gameplay. I don't think it succeeded in any of those goals. Herding goats, collecting light spirit bugs, protecting a carriage with a wonky controlling horse, none of this I found to be fun. Once you pull that Master Sword though, it's like a whole new game opens up. Now I'm riding on this crazy boar crashing through gates to get to an abandoned prison, I'm snowboarding down to an old castle to help out some giant freaking yetis, time traveling to see the old Temple of Time, sniping enemies like I'm in the Old West. Where was all this in the first half of the game? That's what I want to know. And on top of all that, if you didn't feel like the game was stalling enough for you, you have this. I have nothing else to say other than I don't care if he's the postman from Majora's Mask. Midna, you know what to do. Jumping back to Wolf Link here, something about being forced into wolf form in the beginning of the game just feels bad, and it feels bad when it happens over and over. When you can finally change back and forth freely, it is like a breath of the cleanest, finest air you've ever breathed. Pacing gets a 1 out of 5. I can't think of a game that deserves it more. Thankfully, it finds its footing in this second half, but the first half can be so unbearable at times, it's amazing we all got through it. The only section in the second half that goes on a bit too long is the section to get into the city in the sky. They could have trimmed that down a little bit, but that's honestly just nitpicking at this point and isn't a major issue. So there you have it, folks. That is the Twilight Princess review. I know it was a long time coming. It's a great game, but it's a flawed game. If it had the kind of pacing and fun of the second half through all of the entire game, we'd be looking at one of the greatest games ever made, but it just stumbles so hard at the start. That being said, let's get to the scores. So we've gone through every category, and here's the recap of the scores. Averaging out, we get a score of 3.7 out of 5. Now, surprisingly, and much to my own surprise as well, the highest rated game so far. We've covered Skyward Sword, the original Legend of Zelda, Phantom Hourglass, Oracle of Seasons, and the Wind Waker in previous videos, so here is where we stand with all 6 games. As we rate each game, we will continue to populate this list and slowly build the Ultimate Zelda series ranking. Make sure to let me know in the comments how you would rank Twilight Princess. Now let's take a look at the next Zelda game we will be reviewing. Thank you for watching.